Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this weekly Hebrew word study. Apologize for being out last week. I was not feeling well. I am starting to feel better now. So thank you for your thoughts and prayers while I was battling this illness. So today we pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 28. And if you remember, from 2 weeks ago, we're following the walk of David as he is running from Saul. And David is now in a strange position where he has gone out of the land of Israel and into the land controlled by the Philistines. And he has aligned himself with King Lachish and has appeared to win his confidence. And what this does is now put David in a very precarious situation of uh, of alignment with the Philistines who are about to go to battle Israel. And David is put in a place where he has to fight against his own kinsmen, Israel. And so it puts David in a very tough position. And we're going to see an interesting way that David navigates this. And ultimately, we will see how God gets him out of it. So we're in 1 Samuel chapter 28, starting with the first verse. Uh, Again, Vayehi, Vayamim, Ha'e, Vayik, Su. So in those days, gathered together, Philistim, El Machanehem, the armies, uh, Latzabah for war, Latzabah for war. And again, noticing here the word for fight, lehilachem has the word lechem in. Remember that the word for battle and war has the word for bread in it of lechem, and that is because it is thought that most of the wars were fought for food once upon a time. So David goes to Achish, and Achish says, you're going to come with me, you're going to fight my battle for me. And look how David answers in verse 2. And David says to Achish, surely you know what your servant can do. So this is as big of an answer as you can give him. He doesn't say yes, he doesn't say no. He just says, you know what your servant can do. He is putting himself in using the word of avdecha, of servant, so he is submitting himself, and maybe that was enough for Achish. And Achish just kind of says, okay, I take this as a positive. He now puts him as his personal bodyguard. He says to David, "You're going to be my chief bodyguard for me forever." So this is, they're making pinky alliances here. They're Ashish is feeling that David is all in. Ashish is all trusting, and David is going, "What am I going to do now? I am so in a spot." And so this ambiguous answer that David gives, of course, causes us to want to look at, what is going on here. Of course, we know because we read the rest of the story, obviously the Lord gets David out of this. And so this is what we think that the reason David answers this way is because he doesn't know what's going to happen, but he wants to trust God for deliverance. He knows he can't go and fight his own countrymen, and he is putting this in God's hands and giving kind of a very wishy-washy answer, doesn't commit himself to this, doesn't say yes or no, but stalls for time, basically. And what happens then in this narrative, we go from verse 2 to verse 3, and this rest of this chapter, verse 3 through the end of the chapter, is totally out of context. It shifts context entirely. And in fact, most of the commentators would say that this section of verse 3 to verse 25 really needs to be cut and pasted in at the end of chapter 29. And if you do that, the narrative fits perfectly. Um, it didn't happen that way. And again, we can't change it, obviously, but we can look at it and say, okay, what is happening here? This is a stalling moment on David, trying to stall for God to work in here. And maybe that's why this is put in here the way it is to show that time is passing, and it gives David time to allow God to work in his life. We know that that's what eventually works out, but again, if you were to look at the narrative of the story, this is totally out of the context of the narrative and should be at the end of chapter 29. The other thing you'll notice here too is David speaks to Ashish, and remember, David is Hebrew, and so he speaks Hebrew. Ashish is a Philistine. He doesn't speak Hebrew. So we know that David and Ashish are communicating, or Ashish is communicating, and so they must be speaking what we would think would be Aramaic at that time, which was or if there was a language of the Philistines, that David was at least bilingual to be able to communicate. And that's something we need to remember too in living here in North America. We are not accustomed to knowing numerous languages. Some are bilingual, Spanish or Hmong and English, but again, we're not very used to that. Some of our ancestors, depending upon where we immigrated from, may have spoken those native languages of Dutch or Polish or German or Russian when they came over, but we've all lost that. But other countries where they are small and they're always interacting and there's always differences in leadership are very accustomed to having multiple languages being spoken. And this is good for us to know when we do New Testament studies and just to know that who's speaking and what language could they be speaking in and the way they're communicating. So we get to verse 3 here, and the whole thing changes. In fact, verse 3 is identical to in chapter 25, um, when it starts out, it says, "And Samuel died, and everybody lamented for him. Israel buried him in Ramah in his own city." And that whole thing is just a repeat of chapter 25. So again, a very strange break in the narrative here of recapping. Um, but what it does give us that we will take away here is it tells us where Saul is at, and it tells us the spiritual condition of Saul, and that he is just tumbling and falling. And this sets the stage for where this will pick up again in chapter 29 when this battle resumes. So we look here that Saul is um, falling, and he um, had mediums in his city. And these mediums, this is the words we're going to kind of look at here because it says that, Saul freaked out over what's happening, and he was trembling in his heart. And we see that verse 6 that the Lord did not answer Saul. He didn't answer him by personally. He didn't answer him in dreams. He didn't answer him through the Urim and Thummim, which are these divining stones. And he didn't answer him by the prophets. What's interesting here is there were prophets in the land after Samuel died. We know there was a school of the prophets. We see a little bit of interaction by them, but again, we tend to lose the understanding that the tabernacle is still set up in Shiloh. There are still priests there. There are still prophets there. There's a little enclave that seems to be totally separate from what's going on here with David and with Saul that are maintaining the rituals, maintaining the sacrifices, maintaining the feast days. And but yet it's the two are not mixing together, and the two are not influencing one another. They're totally separate. And here, when Saul gets in trouble, he runs back to Shiloh, tries to talk to anybody spiritual, and finds that God didn't answer him. It is interesting here that it uses the tetragrammaton in for the word for God or Yahweh, again connotating the merciful, benevolent side of God that obviously Saul is trying to appeal to. He's not wanting God to be in an Elohim or a battle mode. He's really digging deep and trying to get in touch with God, and nothing is happening. Nothing is going on. And we see here in verse 5 that Saul is trembling in his heart. And what we want to look at here is where Saul goes. And we're going to go up to verse 7 here. That these people that Saul is turning to are spiritual mediums. And of course, the Bible, depends upon what translation that you have, will talk about these very different. Some will use the word spiritual. Here it use mediums and spiritualists. But let's take a look at these two words because they're quite telling. So we're going to open up H178, and the word for spiritualist comes from the word ov, um, and it's comes from a bottle. So what's interesting here is what is the terminology of why is a bottle being brought together with the thought of someone who is dealing in um, these dark dark areas. So we're going to take a look at the um, lexicon for Gesenius. We're going to take a look up the word for ov, and we're going to find something very, very interesting. So again, make sure you never feel inhibited about looking up these words. It's very, very easy to do that. And so when we look up the word ov, it starts out with, here you can see it, a bottle from carrying water, but then the second meaning of it is a soothsayer. And so a lot to be said about here, what this means, but what they talk about is that these ventriloquists, these people who would practice these black magic or magician type things would come and use a bottle, and they would it's here we see talked about that it is similar to a vessel being used to contain something. And of course we know that there's many times spoken in the Bible about being possessed, that people are possessed by spirits that are not of God. And so it gives us the indication that the body here can be like a bottle that contains a spirit. And of course, we see this same thing referenced in Jesus when he speaks about putting old wine in new bottles and new wine in old bottles. You see a little bit of that expression here ties back to this thought that a vessel like our body would be a bottle, like a bottle, and contains something. It contains either the Spirit of God or a spirit that's not from God. And so kind of a neat illustration here as to why this word bottle is being used for someone who has a spirit within them, um, being expressed here. And then that ties in with this next word of that's H3049, sometimes called spiritualist, and it's called a familiar spirit. What's interesting here is the root word is the word yada, and that word is used throughout the Bible in different forms as an expression of knowing. It's used as the same word of Adam knew his wife in a very intimate way. Also, it's being used in the same way as knowing God, of having a relationship with God. So it's, again, remember, Hebrew does not have a lot of words to it. It has around 7,500 words in biblical or classical Hebrew. Compare that to a million or more words that we have in English to describe things. So words can be spelled the same, but have different meanings. And so this is definitely one where this person who has this spirit inside of him, like a bottle containing this spirit, is using it to have a knowledge, to have a relationship, to have intimacy in that direction. And again, not hard for us to understand that. We want to do the same thing when it comes to having a relationship with God. We want to seek after Him. We want to know Him in many different levels of expression and of relationship. And so it shouldn't be hard to imagine that the same understanding and same knowing can be used on the opposite end of the spectrum for dealing with spirits that are not of God. So we see that brought out here. And so we finish up as we get to verse 7, where we're going to stop. That Saul is at his wits' end. He can't get God to answer him. And so he says to his servants, he says, find me a woman who is again, uses this word ov, a bottle, a medium, someone who contains this type of familiar spirit or a spirit that is in tune with the a spirit that is not of God, but has this relationship with that type of dark side, if you will, or evil spirits. And so he says that I want to go and inquire of her how far he has fallen, how desperate he is. Again, it's easy to dump on Saul as to where he is, but again, uh, we all know too easily how quickly we fall into very similar traps of if we don't get the answer we want, we turn to whatever source we feel we know of. And so we just have to see what happens here. He talks about this, he gets the word that there is a woman who has this type of bottled spirit, and she lives in Endor. Always kind of interesting if you watch any of the sci-fi movies of Star Wars and Star Trek, you'll see that there are names used in there from the Bible that end up coming into those realms too, because they're just names that struck with the writers, but this is another one, Endor. You'll find that being spoken about. So we're going to leave this today. I pray that you gained a little bit of insight as to what David was going through, and come back next week and we'll see what happens with Saul and as he meets this lady of the medium woman at Endor. All right. God bless you and have yourself a wonderful rest of your week. Bye bye.